The lantern's glow trembled, painting the stone walls in flickering shades of gold and shadow, revealing a secret that had slept for 200 years. Below, nestled in the earth, lay a chest that would change everything. Before we carry on, please hit the subscribe button to make my day and let me know where you are watching from in the comments. Sarah's face, etched with the fine lines of sleepless nights and a worry that had become a permanent resident in her soul, caught the unsteady light. In her late 30s, she looked as if she were weathering a storm that had long since passed, but had left her stranded on an unfamiliar shore. The divorce had been a slow, grinding erosion of not just her finances, but her sense of self. Her ex-husband, Mark, had a talent for making victory look like magnanimity, leaving her with just enough to feel the full weight of her failure, but not enough to build anything new. Yet, in the deep brown of her eyes, a flicker of resilience refused to be extinguished. It was a stubborn, quiet flame, and it was all she had left. Beside her, her 8-year-old son, Leo, stood with the quiet solemnity of a child who had learned to navigate the emotional minefield of adult sorrow by retreating into the vast, colorful landscapes of his own mind. He was an observant boy, his gaze missing nothing, from the weary slump of his mother's shoulders to the way the shadows danced like ghostly figures on the chapel walls. The upheaval had stolen some of his boyish boisterousness, replacing it with a pensive watchfulness. Clinging close to Leo's leg was Buddy, a brown Labrador whose loyalty was as deep and unconditional as his soulful eyes. He was more than a pet. He was a furry guardian, a warm, breathing anchor in the turbulent sea of their lives, his presence a constant, reassuring pressure. Their new, improbable home was on the outskirts of Havenwood Hollow, a town that wore its economic depression like a threadbare coat. Once a thriving community built on timber and trade, its glory had faded into memory, leaving behind a main street of shuttered shops and a pervasive sense of resignation. The chapel itself was a local legend, a place whispered about in ghost stories told by children who were both drawn to and terrified of it. It sat low in a dip of land where the fog gathered like a shroud, a skeletal finger of a steeple pointing accusingly at a perpetually gray sky. The townsfolk said the place was soured, best left to the ghosts and the gloom. The memory of the auction was still a fresh sting, a mix of humiliation and a strange, defiant pride. It had been held in the town hall, a cavernous room that smelled of floor polish and stale coffee. Sarah had stood at the back, feeling the weight of dozens of gazes, each one a pinprick of judgment. She had watched properties she could never afford go for tens of thousands, her own desperation a cold knot in her stomach. Then came Lot 73, the derelict chapel on Old Mill Road. The auctioneer, a grizzled man named Mr. Abernathy with a voice like gravel, had presented it with an almost apologetic air. "Needs a bit of work," he'd understated, to a ripple of dry chuckles. When he called for an opening bid, the room fell silent. Sarah's voice, when she finally found it, was barely a whisper. $10. The silence that followed was different. It was thick with a mixture of pity and scorn. Mr. Abernathy squinted, adjusting his glasses as if to see her more clearly. $10? He repeated, his surprise evident. He looked around the room, his gaze sweeping over the faces of farmers and small business owners, but no one else moved. "Sold," he finally declared, his gavel cracking against the podium with a sound of finality. "To the lady in the back for $10. As she walked forward to sign the papers, the murmurs followed her like a swarm of insects. Later, as he handed her the keys, a bundle of rusted iron that looked as ancient as the building itself, Mr. Abernathy had offered a word of caution. "No one stepped foot in there since the 1970s, ma'am," he'd warned, his voice low. "They say the ground is soured." Sarah had simply met his gaze, her chin held high, and replied with a quiet determination that surprised even herself. "It's what I can afford." Driving away, she felt a dizzying cocktail of emotions. There was the hot shame of her poverty being laid bare for the whole town to see, but beneath it, a strange and powerful sense of empowerment was taking root. This ruin, this forgotten, broken place, was hers. It was a tangible, albeit crumbling, piece of a new life. Now, standing before it, the reality of her purchase settled in. The air was thick and heavy, carrying the smell of damp earth, decaying wood, and a century of neglect. The fog clung to the hollow, muffling the sounds of the world beyond and isolating them in a pocket of time. Their footsteps were the only sound, a lonely crunch on the gravel path leading to the heavy oak doors. Buddy whined softly, pressing against Leo's side, his tail low as he sniffed the air, sensing the profound and long-standing abandonment of the place. Sarah put her shoulder to the door. It groaned in protest, a deep, guttural sound that echoed the building's long slumber, before finally giving way. The interior was a cathedral of dust and silence. Slivers of light, tinted by the grime on the surviving panes of stained glass, pierced the gloom, illuminating swirling motes of dust that danced like tiny, ethereal spirits. The pews, coated in a thick gray blanket, stood in silent rows, their occupants long gone. As Sarah's eyes adjusted, she could make out the altar at the far end, draped in shadows. Leo, his initial apprehension giving way to a childlike curiosity, stepped forward. He ran a small finger across the back of a pew, leaving a clean, dark line in the grime, a perfect cross. Buddy, meanwhile, began a thorough investigation, his nose to the floor as he trotted purposefully down the main aisle, his claws clicking softly on the stone. Sarah ran a hand over a cold, damp wall, the stone weeping with moisture. She could feel the immense weight of its history, the countless prayers whispered into its very fabric, the joys and sorrows it had witnessed before being left to fade. She walked slowly towards the pulpit, her boots echoing in the vast, empty space. It felt like trespassing on a forgotten grave. The pulpit itself was a beautifully carved piece of dark wood, miraculously preserved from the worst of the decay. As she reached the steps leading up to it, her heel caught on something. It wasn't the unevenness of the old stone floor. It was something else, a distinct shift. She looked down. One of the large flagstones at the base of the pulpit was slightly askew. It rocked with a hollow, clattering sound that seemed deafening in the profound silence. Her curiosity, a trait she thought had been buried under the weight of her recent life, was suddenly sharply piqued. She knelt, the cold of the stone seeping through the worn denim of her jeans. She tried to pry the edge of the tile up with her fingernails, but they were short and the stone was heavy. It was wedged tight. Then she remembered the old, rust-flecked screwdriver she kept in the glove compartment of her car, a relic from a toolbox Mark had left behind. She told Leo to stay with Buddy, her voice steadier than she felt, and walked back out into the misty air, the groan of the heavy door sealing her back into the chapel's dusty embrace moments later. Kneeling again, she worked the tip of the screwdriver into the crack. With a grating screech of metal against stone, she leveraged it. The tile lifted, but beneath it was not the packed dirt and rubble she had expected. Instead, the removal of the stone revealed a dark, perfectly circular opening, about 3 feet in diameter, its edges lined with smooth, expertly fitted stones. It looked like the mouth of a well, and set into the center of the darkness was a heavy, black iron ring, thick with rust but undeniably solid. Her heart began to pound against her ribs, a frantic, heavy rhythm. This was something else, something hidden. Leo, drawn by the noise, came to her side, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and excitement. "What is it, Mom?" he whispered, his voice a small sound in the cavernous space. "I don't know, sweetie," she breathed, her own voice tight. Probably just an old well or part of the foundation. But she didn't believe it. The careful stonework, the deliberate placement, it all felt intentional. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, closed around the cold iron ring. She took a deep breath, braced her feet, and pulled. For a moment, nothing happened. She grunted with the effort, her muscles straining. Then, with a deep, sucking sound, a heavy oak slab, round and thick, began to lift away from the opening. It was surprisingly well preserved, the wood dark and dense, protected from the damp by the stone above. As it came free, a rush of air rose from the shaft below. It was cold, ancient air, carrying the scent of deep earth, of stone, and something else, something she couldn't quite place, a dry, dusty smell of things long undisturbed. Her hand trembled as she picked up the lantern she had set on the floor. With a silent prayer to a god she hadn't spoken to in years, she lowered it into the darkness. The light descended, pushing back the shadows, its glow catching on the damp stone walls of the shaft. It wasn't deep, perhaps only 8 or 9 feet. And then the light found it. Resting at the bottom, centered perfectly in the small space, was a chest. It was small, bound with iron straps, its surface dark and pitted with age. It wasn't a pirate's chest from one of Leo's stories. It was something older, something real. And it was waiting. A plan, frantic and half-formed, sparked in Sarah's mind. She scrambled back to her car, her heart a wild drum against her ribs, and retrieved the emergency kit Mark had always insisted they keep. Inside, beneath jumper cables and a fluorescent vest, was a coil of nylon rope. It wasn't thick, but it looked strong. Back in the chapel's dusty silence, she found a discarded piece of metal near the crumbling vestry, a long, thin iron bracket that might have once held a shelf. Using a loose stone from the floor, she painstakingly bent one end into a crude hook. Her hands shook, not just from the cold, but from a terrifying, exhilarating hope that felt like a long-dormant nerve suddenly shocked back to life. She tied the rope securely to the lantern and lowered it again, the light swinging wildly, casting dancing, distorted shadows across the small chamber below. The chest sat there, impassive and ancient. She then tied the other end of the rope to her makeshift hook. Leo, his face pale in the gloom, watched her every move, his earlier fear now replaced by a wide-eyed, breathless fascination. "Is it pirate treasure, Mom?" he whispered, his voice echoing slightly in the vast, still space. Sarah paused, her knuckles white as she gripped the rope. She looked at her son, at his innocent, hopeful face, and her own fear felt sharp and protective. "I don't know, sweetie," she answered, her voice tight and strained. "But we're going to be very careful." Lowering the hook was a game of frustrating delicacy. It clanked against the stone sides of the shaft, the sound unnervingly loud. Twice, she thought she had it, only for the hook to slip off the chest's curved handle. Her arms began to ache, a deep burn settling into her shoulders. "A little to the left, Mom," Leo directed, his small voice a beacon of focus in her rising panic. On the 4th try, the hook caught. She felt the solid connection, a satisfying weight on the end of the line. She pulled gently, and the rope went taut. It was holding. Now came the real test. She wrapped the rope around her hands, ignoring the bite of the nylon into her skin, and began to pull. The chest was heavier than it looked, a dead, unyielding weight. For a moment, it didn't move, and despair washed over her. Then, with a loud, grating scrape of metal on stone, it shifted. She pulled again, her back screaming in protest, her boots slipping on the dusty floor. Buddy, sensing the struggle, began to whine, a low, anxious sound from the back of his throat. The chest scraped and bumped its way up the shaft, each sound a victory, each inch a triumph. Finally, with one last, desperate heave, she pulled it over the edge. It landed on the chapel floor with a heavy, resonant thud that seemed to shake the very stones beneath them. For a long moment, Sarah could only kneel beside it, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with exhaustion and adrenaline. Leo crept closer, reaching out a tentative hand but not quite daring to touch it. Together, they dragged it away from the hole, towards the center of the chapel, the iron straps leaving long scratches in the centuries of dust. It was locked. A complex, rust-encrusted mechanism stood between them and whatever lay inside. There was no key. Sarah looked at the lock, then at the screwdriver still clutched in her hand. There was no finesse to what came next. She wedged the tip of the screwdriver into the lock's housing and, using the same stone she'd used to bend the hook, she began to hammer at it. The sound was brutal and violent in the sacred quiet, a series of sharp, metallic cracks that echoed off the high ceiling. Rust flaked away, and with a final, jarring crack, the lock broke apart. The lid was stiff. It creaked open like a coffin, the sound a low groan of protest at being disturbed after so long. Sarah held her breath. The lantern light spilled inside, and she felt a dizzying wave of disbelief, so powerful it almost buckled her knees. It wasn't just gold coins, though there were some, their surfaces gleaming with a soft, buttery light. Nestled on a bed of what had once been rich, dark velvet, now faded to a pale lavender, was a breathtaking collection of handcrafted jewelry. A necklace of emeralds, each stone the size of a robin's egg, lay coiled like a sleeping serpent. There were rings set with deep blue sapphires, brooches of intricate silver filigree, and a ruby pendant that seemed to drink the light, glowing with an inner fire. Beneath the jewelry was a stack of small, leather-bound journals, their covers brittle with age, and beside them, a rolled-up sheet of parchment, yellowed and sealed with a blob of dark wax. The sheer, exquisite beauty of it all, the palpable sense of history, stole the air from her lungs. This wasn't just money. It was a miracle. It was a second chance, a way out, a future she hadn't dared to dream of. Leo let out a soft gasp, his small fingers reaching out to reverently touch the surface of the ruby pendant, his touch as light as a butterfly's wing. The next day, a profound sense of unreality followed Sarah as she drove her rattling, rust-pocked car out of Havenwood Hollow. She had carefully wrapped a handful of the gold coins and a small, elegant silver brooch in a soft cloth and placed them in her pocket. The weight of them was a constant, unbelievable reminder. She couldn't risk taking them to anyone in town. The news would spread like wildfire. Instead, she drove for an hour to a neighboring town, a place larger and more anonymous, and found the address she'd looked up at the library. Pembroke Antiquities was a small, respectable-looking shop on a quiet side street, its window filled with porcelain dolls and tarnished silver tea sets. Arthur Pembroke was a kindly, bespectacled man in his late 60s, with a gentle demeanor and the patient eyes of a scholar. He greeted her with a warm smile, his shop smelling of beeswax and old paper. Sarah, her heart hammering, unwrapped the items on his polished mahogany counter. Arthur's eyes, magnified by his thick lenses, widened almost imperceptibly as he looked at the coins. He picked one up, his touch surprisingly delicate, and examined it under a jeweler's loupe. He was silent for a long time, his brow furrowed in concentration. Then he turned his attention to the brooch. He ran a finger over the intricate design, his expression shifting from curiosity to outright astonishment. "My dear woman," he said at last, his voice trembling slightly as he looked up at her. "Where did you get these?" Sarah hesitated, offering a vague story about an inheritance. Arthur didn't press, his focus entirely on the objects before him. "This craftsmanship," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "It's extraordinary. This is from the late 18th century. I'm almost certain of it. The style, the weight of the gold, it's all consistent with that period. And this brooch, it's a masterpiece." He finally looked her directly in the eye, his own gaze filled with a dawning excitement. "You say there are more items?" "A small chest full," Sarah admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Arthur took off his glasses and polished them slowly with a handkerchief. He seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "Based on these pieces alone, and assuming the rest of the contents are of a similar quality and historical significance," he said, his voice now hushed with awe, "I would have to conduct a far more thorough evaluation, of course, but a preliminary estimate? The entire collection could be worth upwards of $12 million. $12 million. The words hung in the air, incomprehensible. Sarah felt the room tilt, the floor seeming to drop away from beneath her feet. She gripped the edge of the counter to steady herself. It was a number so vast, so far beyond the scope of her reality, that it felt like a fiction. It was the answer to every prayer she had ever whispered into a dark, empty room. It was safety. It was a new life for Leo. It was freedom. That night, the chapel felt different. The discovery of the treasure had transformed it from a forgotten ruin into a vault, a sanctuary. With nowhere else to go and a deep-seated fear of leaving the chest unguarded, Sarah and Leo had made a small camp for themselves in the chancel. They had sleeping bags, a cooler with sandwiches and juice boxes, and the lantern, which cast a warm, protective glow around them. Leo, exhausted by the day's excitement, was already asleep, his small form curled up beside a slumbering Buddy. But Sarah couldn't sleep. The appraiser's words echoed in her mind. A dizzying, unbelievable mantra. $12 million. She sat with her back against the cold stone of the altar, watching the shadows. The wind had picked up outside, moaning around the corners of the old building and rattling the loose frame of a high window. Suddenly, Buddy lifted his head, a low, guttural growl rumbling deep in his chest. The fur on his back bristled. He stood up, his body tense, and stared intently at the main doors, his growl becoming more insistent. "What is it, boy?" Sarah whispered, her own body going rigid. She crept to one of the cracked stained glass windows, her heart beginning to pound with a new, cold fear. She peered through a section where the colored glass was missing, her view restricted to a narrow slice of the graveyard and the fog-shrouded trees beyond. At first, she saw nothing but the shifting mist and the dark, leaning shapes of old headstones. Then, a figure detached itself from the deeper shadows at the edge of the cemetery. It was a man, tall and silhouetted against the fog, standing perfectly still, watching the chapel. He was too far away to make out any features, a mere column of darkness in the gloom. As she watched, her breath held tight in her chest. He seemed to sense her gaze. He took one step back, and then simply melted into the fog, vanishing as silently as he had appeared. Sarah stood frozen for a long time, her blood running cold. She told herself it was just a local, someone curious about the light in the abandoned chapel. But the seed of fear that had been planted was already beginning to sprout, its roots twisting around the fragile stem of her newfound hope. A few days later, the sleek, arrogant purr of an expensive engine shattered the hollow's quiet. Sarah was outside, trying to clear some of the overgrown weeds from the path, when a black sedan, so polished it seemed to suck the light out of the gray afternoon, pulled up. Her stomach clenched. She knew that car. It was her ex-husband, Mark. He got out, looking as handsome and out of place as a wolf in a sheep pen. He was dressed in a tailored suit, his smile as smooth and predatory as ever. "Sarah, darling," he said, his voice like silk, gliding over the space between them. He surveyed the crumbling chapel, his lips curling in a faint, condescending smirk. "I heard you struck gold. A little bird told me you bought this old dump. You always did have a flair for the dramatic." Sarah's hand tightened on the handle of the rusty trowel she was holding. She stood her ground, her body a shield between him and the chapel door, behind which Leo was reading one of the old journals, fascinated by the script. "What do you want, Mark?" she asked, her voice flat and cold. He strolled closer, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few feet from her, his gaze sweeping over her worn clothes with disdain before returning to the chapel. "You know," he said conversationally, his tone light but his eyes turning hard and cold, "my family has roots in this town, deep roots." He paused, letting the words hang in the air. "Some might say we have a claim to anything found on this land. A historical claim." Sarah's blood ran cold. It wasn't a coincidence. The shadowy figure in the graveyard, Mark's sudden appearance, it was all connected. He knew. He must have been having her watched. His presence here was a violation, a desecration of the one place she had begun to feel safe, of the one thing that was truly hers. Her joy, so new and brilliant, began to curdle into a familiar, sickening dread. Mark's words were not just an observation. They were a threat, a declaration of intent. He was laying the groundwork for a battle she was terrified she was not equipped to fight. She stood protectively in front of the chapel, her newfound hope feeling as fragile as a pane of ancient, cracked glass. Mark's threat lingered in the damp chapel air long after his car had gone, a toxic residue that coated every surface. The initial, dizzying elation of her discovery had been tainted, the $12 million no longer a symbol of pure, unadulterated freedom but a heavy, dangerous secret. Fear, cold and sharp, had replaced the warmth of hope. That night, with Leo sleeping soundly beside a watchful buddy, Sarah knew she could not simply wait for Mark's next move. His words about his family's deep roots were a key, and she felt with a chilling certainty that the lock it opened was hidden somewhere within the brittle pages of the journals she had pulled from the earth. She carefully lifted the first journal from the chest. The leather cover was dry and cracked, flaking away at the edges. It smelled of old parchment, of dust, and of time itself. She opened it under the golden pool of the lantern's light, the pages rustling with a sound like dry leaves skittering across pavement. The script was elegant, a looping, cursive hand from an era when penmanship was an art form, but the ink had faded to a ghostly brown, making it difficult to decipher. For hours, she sat hunched over the small book, the silence of the chapel broken only by the soft sigh of Leo's breathing and the occasional scratch of Buddy's claws on the stone floor as he shifted in his sleep. The intensity of her focus was a physical thing, a palpable energy in the small circle of light. She was no longer just a desperate mother. She was a historian, an archaeologist, piecing together a story that had been buried for more than 2 centuries. Slowly, painstakingly, the words began to form a narrative. The journal belonged to a man named Elias Thorne, a town elder in the late 1790s. He wrote not of daily life, but of a secret. He and a small group of trusted townsfolk, merchants, farmers, and a blacksmith, had formed a society. They called themselves the Guardians of the Hollow. Their purpose was born of desperation. Havenwood Hollow, in those days, was being systematically bled dry by a corrupt English nobleman, a man named Lord Harrington, who had been granted the land by the Crown and saw it not as a community to nurture but as a resource to exploit. He levied impossible taxes, seized property on flimsy pretexts, and ruled with an iron fist wielded by hired men. The journal entries spoke of a growing despair among the townspeople, a fear that their future was being stolen from them. The treasure, Sarah realized with a jolt that made her sit bolt upright, was not the plunder of some forgotten pirate. It was the town's collective savings. The Guardians had secretly pooled every spare shilling, every piece of family silver, every valuable they could hide from Harrington's greedy eyes. They had converted it into gold and jewels, a concentrated, portable fortune, and hidden it away, a seed for a future generation to plant when the blight of Lord Harrington had finally passed. The chapel, built by their own hands, was their secret bank, the shaft beneath the pulpit their vault. Elias Thorne's final entry in the first journal was a prayer, a desperate plea that their sacrifice would not be in vain, that one day, the people of Havenwood Hollow would reclaim their legacy. Sarah's hands trembled as she closed the book. The weight of the chest suddenly felt immense, not in pounds, but in responsibility. This wasn't her money. It was a sacred trust, the distilled hope of an entire community. She picked up the second journal, her movements now filled with a new sense of reverence. This one was written in the same hand, but the entries were more sporadic, the tone more urgent, more fearful. Elias wrote of Lord Harrington becoming more suspicious, his thugs more brutal. He wrote of near misses, of searches that came dangerously close to their secret. Then she found the entry that made her blood run cold. It was one of the last, dated in the autumn of 1798. Elias wrote that Lord Harrington had brought in a new associate, an American from a wealthy Boston family, a man as ruthless as Harrington himself, but with a cunning the nobleman lacked. This man was instrumental in terrorizing the town, in rooting out dissent, his methods cruel and efficient. He seemed to take a particular pleasure in the suffering of the townspeople. The journal described him as having a serpent's smile and a heart of winter. And then, there was the name, written in a hand that shook with either fear or rage, the ink slightly smeared as if by a trembling finger. The name of Lord Harrington's ruthless American associate was Alastair Morrison. Morrison, Mark's last name. The journal slipped from her numb fingers and fell to the floor with a soft thud. Couldn't be. It was a coincidence, a trick of her tired, overwrought mind. But she knew it wasn't. Mark's words echoed in her head. My family has roots in this town. Deep roots. He had bragged about it for years, about his prestigious lineage, about how his ancestors were influential figures in early American commerce. Alastair Morrison, Mark's great-great-great-grandfather. The truth hit her with the force of a physical blow, knocking the air from her lungs. Mark's family wasn't just from Havenwood Hollow. They were the descendants of the very people who had stolen from it, who had terrorized it. The treasure wasn't just a local legend to them. It was their lost family fortune. A prize they had likely been searching for generations. Mark hadn't heard about her luck by chance. The shadowy figure in the graveyard wasn't a curious local. It was one of Mark's men. He hadn't just stumbled upon her. He had been watching the chapel, waiting, perhaps for years, for someone to finally uncover the secret his ancestor had failed to steal. A surge of pure, righteous anger, hot and cleansing, washed through her. It burned away the last vestiges of her fear, replacing it with a hard, cold resolve. This was not about money anymore. It was not about her and Mark, or the bitter dregs of their failed marriage. This was about justice. It was about the people of Havenwood Hollow, past and present. It was about the sacrifice of Elias Thorne and the Guardians. Mark wasn't just trying to take her money. He was trying to complete a theft that had begun over 200 years ago. And she, a divorced, broke, single mother, was the only one standing in his way. The threats, when they began in earnest, were no longer subtle. A few days after her discovery in the journals, she woke to find a dead crow lying on the chapel's heavy oak doorstep. Its wings were spread, its black eyes like dull, accusing beads. It was a message, a piece of crude, violent symbolism meant to terrorize her. She disposed of it before Leo could see, her hands shaking with fury, not fear. 2 days after that, she went to drive into the new, larger town for supplies, only to find all 4 tires on her old car slashed, the rubber gaping in wide, ugly wounds. She was stranded. Mark was tightening the net, isolating her, cutting off her connection to the outside world. The worst came one night during a storm. The wind howled through the hollow, and rain lashed against the stained glass windows. Sarah and Leo were huddled in their sleeping bags, the lantern casting long, dancing shadows that writhed like living things. Buddy, who had been restless all evening, suddenly shot to his feet, a ferocious, deep-chested bark erupting from him as he stared at a window on the far side of the chancel. Over the roar of the storm, Sarah heard it, a faint, scraping sound, then the sharp splintering of wood. Someone was trying to pry open the window frame. Leo sat up, his eyes huge and terrified in the flickering light. "Is it the bad man, Mom?" he whispered, his small body trembling. Sarah's own heart was a frantic bird beating against her ribs, but she wrapped her arms around him, pulling him into a fierce, protective embrace. Her fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but her voice, when she spoke, was a fortress. "We're safe in here, sweetie," she said, her lips against his hair. "This is our fort. Buddy won't let anyone hurt us." As if on cue, Buddy unleashed another volley of furious barks, lunging towards the window, his teeth bared. The scraping sound stopped. A moment later, they heard the sound of running footsteps, fading quickly into the storm. They were safe for now. But Sarah knew it was a temporary reprieve. Mark was testing her defenses, and he would be back. The next morning, under a sky washed clean by the storm, Sarah knew she couldn't do this alone. She was out of her depth, a pawn in a game whose rules were being written by a man with no conscience and limitless resources. There was only one person she could think of who might help, who had shown her a shred of kindness and integrity. Packing the journals carefully into a canvas bag, she told Leo they were going for a long walk. It took them over an hour to walk the miles to the next town, Buddy trotting protectively beside them the entire way. When she arrived at Pembroke Antiquities, disheveled and with mud on her boots, Arthur Pembroke looked up from his desk with surprise, which quickly turned to concern as he saw her expression. "My dear woman," he said, rising to his feet, "is everything all right?" In the quiet, cluttered back office of his shop, Surrounded by the ghosts of other people's histories, Sarah told him everything. She left nothing out, from the discovery of the chest to Mark's threats, the slashed tires, the attempted break-in, and the chilling revelation from the journals. She showed him the elegant, faded script of Elias Thorne, her finger tracing the name Alastair Morrison. As he listened, Arthur's kindly face transformed. His brow furrowed, his jaw tightened, and his eyes, magnified by his glasses, glinted with a cold anger. He was a man who revered history, and the story she told was a desecration of it. When she finished, he was silent for a long time, his fingertips steepled together. "This is monstrous," he said at last, his voice low and filled with a quiet fury. "This is not just a domestic dispute over an inheritance. This is a matter of historical justice." He looked at the journals with a profound reverence. The guardians of the hollow. I've heard whispers of them, local legends, but I always dismissed it as folklore. He stood up and began to pace the small room. "Your ex-husband is not just a bully. He is a ghoul, attempting to rob a grave 2 centuries cold." He stopped and looked at Sarah, his expression resolute. "I am a member of the County Historical Society," he revealed, his voice gaining strength. "I have access to town archives, to property records, to family lineages going back to the founding of these towns. I can help you authenticate these journals, create an official record of their provenance. We can build a wall of legal protection around this treasure so thick your ex-husband will never be able to touch it." He came and stood before her, his demeanor no longer just that of a gentle shopkeeper, but of a fierce advocate. "I want to help you, Sarah," he said, his voice ringing with sincerity. "Not for a share of the money, I want no part of it, but because this story, this history, must be preserved. The intentions of the guardians must be honored." For the first time in days, Sarah felt a crack appear in the wall of fear and isolation that had been built around her. It was a fragile, tentative hope, but it was real. In the kindly, bespectacled appraiser, she had found an unlikely ally, a guardian in the modern world to stand against the grasping hands of the past. The alliance with Arthur Pembroke shifted the very atmosphere within the chapel. The oppressive weight of isolation began to lift, replaced by the quiet, purposeful energy of 2 people united against a common threat. Hope, which had felt so fragile, now had a foundation. Arthur, true to his word, became not just an advisor but a field marshal in their small, desperate army. He insisted they could not wait for Mark to make the next move. They had to prepare for an assault. The chapel, which had been Sarah's $10 ruin and then her secret vault, was about to become her fortress. They began work immediately, a strange trio of a determined mother, a scholarly historian, and a small boy who saw it all as a grand, serious adventure. Arthur, it turned out, had a surprising knowledge of structural engineering, gleaned from years of studying old buildings. "These places were built to last, Sarah," he explained, his voice echoing slightly as he tapped a thick stone wall. "They were sanctuaries in every sense of the word. The walls are nearly 2 feet thick. The doors were designed to repel more than just a winter storm." He showed her the hidden strengths of her dilapidated church, the way the stones were interlocked, the solid oak beams in the ceiling that could withstand a hurricane. He also pointed out the weaknesses, the crumbling mortar around the lower windows, the rotted frame of a vestry door, the vulnerability of the high, clear-story windows. Their first task was to secure the perimeter. They scavenged old planks from a collapsed section of the choir loft, their surfaces gray and splintered with age. With a hammer and a handful of rusty nails Sarah had found in her car, they boarded up the lower windows, plunging the chapel's interior into a deeper gloom, now lit only by their lanterns and the high, inaccessible stained glass panels. The act felt both desperate and empowering, each nail driven home a small act of defiance. They found a heavy, fallen beam from the belfry, a massive piece of oak that took both their strengths to drag across the stone floor. They wedged it against the main doors, a solid, unmovable barricade. The chapel was no longer a place of quiet contemplation. It was a stronghold, hunkered down and waiting. Leo, far from being frightened by the grim preparations, threw himself into the role of a soldier defending his castle. His small face was a mask of concentration as he followed Arthur's instructions, gathering loose stones from the floor and piling them near the windows to be used as projectiles if needed. He appointed himself the official watchman, taking his post at a high, cracked window that overlooked the path, Buddy sitting faithfully at his feet, a furry, silent sentinel. He would report on the movement of squirrels and the shifting of the fog with a solemn gravity that brought a faint, sad smile to Sarah's face. He was a child playing a game, but the stakes were terrifyingly real. Arthur, meanwhile, devised a makeshift alarm system. He collected a dozen empty tin cans from the supplies Sarah had bought and strung them together with twine she had found in the vestry. He carefully rigged this contraption to the belfry rope, which hung down near the main aisle. "If they try to force the main doors," he explained, his eyes glinting with a clever light, "the vibration will travel up the frame and set this off. It won't stop them, but we'll hear them coming long before they get inside." A bond of deep trust and easy camaraderie was forming between Sarah and the older man. They worked in a comfortable silence, their movements synchronized, a shared understanding passing between them without the need for words. He was the strategist, she was the hands-on commander, and together they were turning this forgotten house of God into a bastion. The attack came 3 nights later. The weather itself seemed to conspire with Mark, a furious autumn storm that rolled into the hollow with a theatrical violence. The wind shrieked like a banshee, and rain hammered against the roof, a relentless, deafening drumming that vibrated through the old wood and stone. Inside, the 3 of them were gathered in the chancel, the air thick with tension. Every gust of wind that rattled a window frame, every creak of the old building, sent a fresh jolt of adrenaline through Sarah. Leo was nestled in his sleeping bag, his eyes wide, while Buddy lay with his head on his paws, emitting a low, constant growl that was barely audible over the storm. It was Buddy who gave them the first real warning. His growl deepened into a full-throated bark, and he scrambled to his feet, his body rigid as he stared towards the north side of the chapel. A second later, a sound, distinct from the chaos of the storm, shattered the night. It was the sharp, sickening crack of a crowbar splintering wood, followed by the explosive crash of glass. They were here. "Get back," Arthur commanded, his voice calm but firm. He grabbed one of the heavy lanterns, his kindly face now a grim, determined mask in the flickering light. A voice, distorted by the wind and rain but unmistakably Mark's, rose from outside. It was a roar of pure, entitled rage. "It's over, Sarah. Give me what's mine. You can't hide in there forever." Another crash, this one louder, was followed by the heavy, rhythmic thud of a sledgehammer against the boarded-up window. The planks splintered, groaning in protest. "To the chancel," Sarah said, her voice tight, grabbing Leo's hand. "Now!" She pulled him towards the altar, towards the relative safety of the thick stone walls and, if necessary, the escape route into the shaft below. The sound of the sledgehammer was the heartbeat of their nightmare. Each blow a countdown to the inevitable invasion. The fortress was about to be breached. The standoff was a terrifying, chaotic ballet of shadows and sound. The thugs, 2 large, brutish men whose faces were obscured by the darkness and the rain, finally smashed their way through the window. One of them clambered inside, his boots crunching on the shattered glass. The other remained outside, passing the sledgehammer to his partner. The air that rushed in was cold and smelled of wet earth and the storm's fury. Sarah, Arthur, and Leo were huddled behind the pulpit, the last line of defense before the hidden shaft. The chest, their prize and their curse, sat nearby, a dark, silent observer. "They'll expect us to be hiding," Sarah whispered, her mind racing, her fear sharpening her senses. "We need to separate them." She looked up towards the belfry rope, where Arthur's tin can alarm hung silently. She had an idea, a desperate, reckless gamble. "The alarm," she breathed to Arthur. "In the bell tower." Arthur understood immediately. While one thug began to methodically smash the pews, searching for them, Sarah crept along the far wall, using the deep shadows cast by the stone columns as cover. She reached the belfry rope and gave it a sharp, hard tug. The cacophony of clattering tin cans that erupted from the darkness of the bell tower was shocking, a frantic, metallic racket that echoed through the entire chapel. The thug who was inside spun around, startled. "What was that?" he yelled to his partner outside. "Sounds like it came from up there." He gestured with the sledgehammer towards the narrow, winding stone staircase that led to the belfry. "Go check it out. She might be hiding up there." As the second thug climbed in through the broken window, the first one started towards the stairs. This was the moment Arthur had been waiting for. Earlier, while they were fortifying the chapel, he had noticed that one of the thick wooden treads on the belfry stairs was loose, its supporting pegs rotted away. While the first thug's attention was on the alarm, Arthur had crept to the base of the stairs and, with a grunt of effort, had worked the tread completely free of its housing, leaving a gaping hole in the staircase. The thug took the first few steps with a heavy, confident tread. Then his foot came down on the empty space. He let out a yell of surprise that was cut short as he pitched forward, his body tumbling down the stone steps with a series of sickening thuds. He landed in a heap at the bottom, groaning, the sledgehammer clattering away from his outstretched hand. One down. But the second thug was already advancing into the chapel, a crowbar held like a weapon. He was moving towards the chancel, his eyes scanning the shadows. Sarah grabbed the only weapon she could find, a heavy, old-fashioned fire extinguisher mounted on the wall near the vestry. It was heavy, its brass nozzle cold in her trembling hands. As the thug passed her hiding spot, she stepped out and pulled the pin. A thick, white cloud of CO2 erupted from the nozzle, blinding him instantly. He roared in pain and confusion, dropping the crowbar and clawing at his eyes, stumbling backward. But now there was Mark. He had entered through the broken window, moving with a predator's grace, his eyes sweeping the scene with a cold, calculating fury. He saw his two men incapacitated, and his gaze locked onto the chancel, onto the pulpit where he knew she must be. He started forward, his handsome face twisted into a mask of rage. It was Leo who saved them. He was hidden in the small space beneath the pulpit, clutching his flashlight, his small body shaking with terror. Buddy was pressed against him, a low, continuous growl vibrating through the small space. As Mark rounded the pulpit, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, Leo did the only thing he could think of. He switched on his flashlight and aimed the bright, narrow beam directly into Mark's eyes. Mark cried out, momentarily blinded, throwing a hand up to shield his face. That split second of disorientation was all Buddy needed. With a ferocious snarl, the Labrador, who had been a gentle, comforting presence their entire lives, transformed into a protective fury. He lunged from beneath the pulpit, a brown and black blur of teeth and muscle. He didn't bite, but he snapped and barked with a savagery that was utterly terrifying, forcing Mark to stagger backward, tripping over a piece of a broken pew. The chapel was suddenly filled with a new sound, a piercing, rising siren that cut through the noise of the storm. Blue and red lights flashed through the broken window, painting the chaotic scene in strobing, hellish colors. The commotion, the smashing and shouting, had finally attracted the attention of a passing patrol car. Sheriff Brody, a man whose world-weary expression rarely changed, burst through the main doors, which his deputy had forced open. He took in the scene in a single, sweeping glance, his hand already on his weapon. He saw the two injured thugs, the white foam of the fire extinguisher, the broken pews, and Mark, scrambling to his feet, his face a picture of snarling rage. He saw Sarah, standing protectively in front of her son, her face pale but resolute. Brody, who had initially dismissed Sarah's concerns as the ramblings of a stressed, imaginative woman, now saw the truth laid bare. "Police! Nobody move!" he bellowed, his voice carrying an authority that instantly froze the chaos. Backup was already arriving, the chapel suddenly flooded with uniformed officers. The siege was over. Mark and his hired thugs were handcuffed and led away, their faces sullen and defeated. As a deputy pushed him towards a squad car, Mark twisted his head, his eyes finding Sarah's across the ruined chapel. They were filled with a pure, undiluted hatred that promised retribution. "This isn't over," he snarled, his voice a venomous whisper that the wind seemed to carry directly to her ears. Then he was gone, swallowed by the flashing lights and the rainy night. The chapel, their fortress, was quiet once more, the silence broken only by the soft, exhausted sobs of a little boy and the gentle, reassuring whine of his loyal dog. In the aftermath, the chapel was profoundly quiet. The storm, as if its purpose had been fulfilled, had dwindled to a soft, mournful drizzle, and the flashing lights of the patrol cars had retreated, leaving only the hollow's deep, familiar silence in their wake. The air was thick with the smell of rain, ozone, and the acrid scent of the fire extinguisher's discharge. Sheriff Brody, his weary face illuminated by the beam of his flashlight, took their statements in a low, patient voice. He looked at the splintered boards, the shattered window, and the groaning thug being loaded into an ambulance, and his earlier skepticism had been replaced by a grim respect. "I'll keep a patrol car at the end of the road for the next few nights," he promised, his gaze lingering on Sarah's pale, determined face. "He won't be getting bail anytime soon, but you can't be too careful." When they were finally alone, the silence returned, heavier this time, freighted with the memory of the violence. The three of them, Sarah, Arthur, and Leo, were a small island of humanity in the vast ruined space. They were exhausted, their bodies humming with the ghost of adrenaline, their clothes damp and smelling of the storm. Arthur, with a surprising practicality, found a small, sterno-like stove in his emergency car kit and heated up 3 cans of soup. They sat on the floor of the chancel, their backs against the cold stone of the pulpit, and ate in near silence, the metallic taste of the soup a strange but comforting reality in the midst of the night's madness. They believed the danger had passed. The immediate threat had been caged, and the relief was so profound it was almost a physical pain. Leo, his small body finally succumbing to a bone-deep weariness, fell asleep with his head in Sarah's lap, his breathing soft and even. Buddy lay beside him, his head resting on his paws, his brown eyes watchful. Sarah looked at Arthur, his kind, scholarly face smudged with dirt and etched with fatigue. A wave of gratitude so powerful it brought tears to her eyes washed over her. She had been so alone, a single unsupported pillar against a hurricane, and he had appeared, a buttress, a shield. "I couldn't have done it without you, Arthur," she said, her voice thick with an emotion she couldn't name. "You saved us." Arthur smiled, a gentle, tired curving of his lips. He reached out and patted her hand, his touch warm and reassuring. "We saved each other," he corrected softly. "The guardians of the hollow, a new generation." He looked away then, his gaze drifting towards the iron-bound chest that sat in the shadows like a sleeping beast. For a fleeting moment, the lantern light caught a strange, unreadable look in his eyes. It was a flicker of something intense and proprietary, a brief, sharp glint that was there and then gone, replaced by his familiar, kindly expression. Sarah, lost in her own exhaustion and relief, dismissed it as a trick of the light, a reflection of the shared trauma of the night. Later that evening, after they had tidied what they could of the mess, a fragile sense of normalcy began to settle over them. Leo was tucked into his sleeping bag, and the chapel was lit by 2 lanterns, casting a warm, steady glow that pushed the deeper shadows back to the walls. Arthur, seemingly energized by his historical purpose, suggested they begin the work of properly cataloging the items in the chest. "The more official our record," he reasoned, his voice filled with a gentle enthusiasm, "the stronger our legal position will be. We must be meticulous." Sarah agreed, the task a welcome distraction from the lingering echoes of fear. She sat beside him as he lifted the items out one by one, his touch reverent. He handled a leather-bound journal, its cover brittle and cool. "It's a remarkable story, isn't it?" he said, his voice a soft murmur. "The guardians of the hollow. Such courage. Such foresight. He opened the book, his fingers tracing the faded script as if reading a sacred text. He turned the pages slowly, his brow furrowed in concentration, until he stopped at a specific entry near the middle of the book. "This one," he said, his voice casual. "This entry is particularly moving." He turned the journal towards her and pointed a finger at a paragraph written in a slightly different, more forceful hand than the entries before it. "My ancestor," he said, his voice still quiet, "was the one who wrote this entry." Sarah stared at him, confused. "Your ancestor?" Arthur nodded, a slow, deliberate movement. He looked up from the journal, and his eyes, magnified by his thick lenses, seemed to bore into her. The kindly, avuncular warmth was gone. In its place was an unnerving, fervent intensity. "My full name," he said, his voice dropping, becoming colder, harder, "is Arthur Pembroke Hale. Elias Thorne was my great-great-great-great-uncle. But the man who wrote this, the man who organized the Guardians, who conceived of this entire plan, was my direct ancestor, Jonathan Hale." The name Hale hung in the air, meaningless to Sarah, but the transformation in the man before her was terrifying. The gentle appraiser, the unlikely ally, was gone, replaced by this stranger with cold eyes and a fanatic's gleam. He revealed that his family had been the secret leaders of the Guardians for generations, passing down the story of the lost treasure as a sacred duty. They had lost track of it after a fire destroyed the town records in the early 1900s, but they had never stopped searching, never given up hope of reclaiming what they saw as their legacy. His kindness to her had not been kindness at all. It had been a mask, a tool. He had been using her, her desperation, her discovery, as his own personal key to unlock his family's birthright. His obsession, hidden so perfectly behind a veneer of scholarly charm, was now laid bare. "This treasure," he said, his voice no longer kind but sharp and edged with a chilling zeal, "was meant to be protected. It was meant to be stewarded by those who understood its sacred purpose." He stood up, his shadow looming large and distorted on the stone wall behind him. "It was not meant to be found and spent by an outsider. It belongs to the Hale family. It belongs to me." The betrayal was so absolute, so stunning, it felt like a physical blow. Sarah could only stare at him, her mind struggling to reconcile the man who had heated soup for her son with the cold-eyed zealot standing before her. He was worse than Mark. Mark's greed was simple, brutal, and honest in its own selfish way. Arthur's was cloaked in righteousness, twisted by generations of entitlement into a holy crusade. He moved towards the chest, his intention clear. He was going to take it. Instinct, raw and primal, took over. Sarah scrambled to her feet, placing herself between him and the chest. "No," she said, her voice a hoarse whisper. "You can't." Arthur stopped. He looked at her not with anger, but with a sort of weary pity that was somehow more insulting. He was not violent like Mark, but he was far more dangerous. He was cunning, manipulative, and he knew all her weaknesses. "Sarah, don't be foolish," he said, his voice softening into a parody of his earlier kindness. "You can't protect it. Mark will come back. The legal system will swallow you and this treasure whole. I am the only one who can keep it safe, as my family has always intended." When she didn't move, his expression hardened again. The mask of civility dropped completely. "Think of your son," he hissed, his voice a venomous whisper. "You're an unemployed single mother, living in a derelict building with no running water. A word from a concerned citizen, a respected historian like myself, to the right people at Child Protective Services. They would take him from you in a heartbeat. You would lose everything." The threat, so cruel and calculated, struck her right where she was most vulnerable. It was the final, horrifying proof that she had been played, that every moment of trust had been a lie. While Arthur was momentarily distracted, his gaze falling possessively on the chest, Sarah acted. Her mind was a blur of panic and desperate strategy. She lunged not for the chest itself, but for the small, rolled-up parchment map and a heavy, leather bag of gold coins she had set aside. She scooped them up, her movements swift and silent. "Leo!" she screamed, her voice tearing through the chapel's silence. "Wake up! We have to go!" Leo, startled from his sleep, sat bolt upright, his eyes wide with confusion and fear. Sarah grabbed his hand, pulling him to his feet. "Run!" she commanded, and they fled. A chase, frantic and terrifying, began through the dark, cavernous chapel. Arthur, stunned for a second by her sudden action, let out a roar of fury and lunged after them. "You can't escape!" he bellowed, his voice echoing in the vast space. He knew the layout of the building intimately, every shadow, every pillar, every pile of rubble. He moved with a frightening speed, trying to cut her off as she scrambled towards the back of the chapel, away from the main doors he knew were barricaded. Buddy, sensing the new, terrifying threat, ran with them, barking furiously at the pursuing figure, a loyal, valiant guard to the last. Sarah's heart hammered against her ribs, her breath coming in ragged, burning gasps. She pulled Leo along, his small legs struggling to keep up. Arthur was gaining on them, his footsteps heavy and relentless on the stone floor. Then, a memory surfaced through her panic, a detail she had noticed days ago while exploring the crumbling rear wall of the apse. A loose stone, low to the ground, hidden behind a tapestry that had rotted to mere threads. She veered towards it, her hands searching frantically in the dark. Her fingers found the edge of the stone. With a desperate grunt, she pulled it free, revealing a small, dark opening, barely large enough to crawl through. "In here!" she gasped to Leo. She pushed him through the hole and scrambled after him, Buddy squeezing through right behind her. They tumbled out into the cold, damp air of the graveyard. The fog was thick, a ghostly white blanket that swallowed sound and sight. They were out, but they were not safe. They could hear Arthur shouting in frustration from inside the chapel, followed by the sound of something heavy being thrown against a wall. He would find another way out. They ran, stumbling over unseen roots and leaning headstones, plunging into the fog-shrouded woods that bordered the cemetery. The forest, which had once seemed a place of eerie beauty, was now a labyrinth of fear, its dark, skeletal trees like the grasping fingers of a nightmare. Behind them, they heard a door crash open. The sounds of Arthur's pursuit, muffled by the fog but undeniably present, began again. Ahead of them, Buddy ran, his barks echoing in the night, a sound that was both a guide and a desperate, lonely warning. The parchment was slick with the damp night air, the leather bag of coins a heavy, swinging pendulum in Sarah's other hand. She ran, her lungs burning, pulling Leo along in her wake. The forest floor was a treacherous landscape of gnarled roots and slick, moss-covered stones. Behind them, Arthur's pursuit was a terrifying, relentless engine of sound, his enraged shouts tearing through the thick, white silence of the fog. He was no longer a man of books and quiet contemplation. He was a hunter, and they were his quarry. Buddy, a brown phantom in the mist, darted ahead, his barks sharp and urgent, a mixture of guidance and alarm. Sarah's mind, a maelstrom of terror and adrenaline, seized on the one object she had managed to save besides her son, the map. She had assumed it was a diagram of the chapel, of other secret passages. But as she ran, she risked a glance, her eyes straining in the gloom. It was not the chapel. It was a crude but detailed drawing of the hollow itself, the river a winding serpent, the woods a cross-hatched mass. And on the far eastern edge, near a ridge she recognized, was a symbol, a stark drawing of a cliff face with a pickaxe crossed beneath it. The old quarry, a place of crumbling ledges and deep, water-filled pits, a place local kids were warned to stay away from. It was a dead end, or perhaps it was the only way out, a desperate, half-formed plan, born of pure instinct, ignited in her mind. She changed direction, pulling a protesting Leo deeper into the woods, towards the ridge, leading her pursuer into a trap of her own. The air grew colder as they climbed, the ground becoming steeper, littered with loose shale that skittered under their feet. They burst from the tree line onto a wide, desolate shelf of rock. It was the quarry. The fog swirled around them, a ghostly sea, partially obscuring the terrifying drop just a few yards away. They were on a wide, crumbling ledge overlooking a chasm of shadow. Arthur emerged from the trees moments later, his face a pale mask of fury in the gloom. His tailored clothes were torn and smeared with mud, his glasses gone, his eyes wild and feral. "Give it to me," he panted, advancing on them, his hands clenched into fists. "It is my birthright, my legacy. You have no claim to it." Sarah stood her ground, her body shielding Leo, who clung to her leg, his face buried in her coat. "It was never yours," she said, her voice shaking but clear, ringing out in the dead, quiet air of the quarry. "It was for the town, for the people your ancestors helped ruin." "Lies!" he shrieked, lunging forward. But his eyes were not on her. They were fixed on the leather bag of coins clutched in her hand, the physical manifestation of his lifelong obsession. In that split second, Sarah acted. With a cry that was part fear and part defiance, she swung her arm and hurled the heavy bag of coins out over the chasm. It sailed through the fog, a dark arc against the swirling white. The sound of the gold, a faint, musical clinking, was the only sound in the world. Arthur's head snapped around, his eyes following the trajectory of the bag. A strangled, guttural cry of pure avarice escaped his lips. His greed, the generational sickness that had poisoned his soul, overrode everything: caution, reason, self-preservation. He didn't lunge for Sarah, he lunged for the treasure. He scrambled towards the edge of the ledge, his hands outstretched as if he could somehow catch the falling gold. His feet, clad in slick, leather-soled shoes, found no purchase on the loose gravel and damp stone. He slipped. For a horrifying moment, he teetered on the brink, his arms windmilling wildly, his face a mask of shocked disbelief. Then, with a final, despairing cry, he tumbled over the edge and vanished into the fog-filled darkness below. The silence that followed was absolute. Sarah stood trembling, her breath held tight in her chest, listening. She did not hear a splash. Instead, after a few terrifying seconds, she heard a muffled thud, followed by a sharp cry of pain and a cascade of falling rocks. He was not dead. She crept to the edge, peering down. The fog had parted slightly, and in the gloom, she could just make out his form. He had landed on a lower, wider ledge about 20 feet down, a steep, impassable embankment of loose scree below him. His leg was twisted at an unnatural angle, and he was clutching it, his face contorted in agony. He was trapped, his own greed the architect of his prison. Sarah looked down at the man who had betrayed her, the man who had threatened her child, and she felt not triumph, but a vast, weary pity. "The treasure was never meant for one person," she shouted down at him, her voice ringing with a newfound, unshakable authority that seemed to come from the very stones around her. "It was meant for everyone." He looked up, his face a pale blur of hatred and pain, and then she turned away, taking Leo's hand and walking back towards the safety of the woods, leaving him to the cold and the fog and the ghosts of his own making. With Arthur and Mark both neutralized, a profound quiet settled over Sarah's life. The treasure, now secured in a bank vault, was no longer a source of fear, but a question. In the quiet solitude of the now silent chapel, she returned to the journals, not with the frantic desperation of a fugitive, but with the calm deliberation of a custodian. She read through Elias Thorne's entries, through Jonathan Hale's forceful plans, and in the very last journal, on the very last page, she found what she was looking for. It was a final entry, written years after the treasure had been hidden, by a man who identified himself only as the last guardian. The script was shaky, the ink faded almost to invisibility. It was a plea, a final testament. If the treasure is ever found, he had written, it must not be a prize for the finder. It must be used to rebuild Havenwood Hollow, to restore the spirit of the community, to give life back to the roots that Lord Harrington and his cronies had tried to poison. It was meant to be a wellspring, not a vault. In that moment, reading those faint, hopeful words, Sarah finally understood the true weight of her discovery. The $12 million was not a lottery win. It was not her escape. It was a responsibility, a sacred trust handed down through 2 centuries of silence. It was a chance not just to rebuild her own life, but to heal the heart of a forgotten town. Months later, the Havenwood Hollow Chapel stood not as a ruin, but as a beacon. The late afternoon sun, a rare and welcome visitor, streamed through newly installed stained glass windows, painting the restored wood of the pews in brilliant strokes of ruby and sapphire and emerald. The building had been meticulously restored, its stone walls cleaned, its steeple once again pointing proudly to the sky. It was no longer a place of ghosts and decay. It was the Havenwood Hollow Community Center and Historical Museum, the story of the guardians of the Hollow, its centerpiece exhibit. Working with a team of lawyers and financial advisors, Sarah had established the Havenwood Hollow Foundation. The treasure, the town's long-lost hope, was now funding scholarships for its children, offering small business grants to aspiring entrepreneurs, and financing the restoration of the town's other historic but neglected buildings. Main Street, once a sad parade of shuttered storefronts, was slowly coming back to life. A new bakery had opened, its windows steamy and its air fragrant with the smell of fresh bread. The old hardware store was being renovated. There was a hum in the air, a current of optimism that the town had not felt in decades. Sarah, too, was transformed. The worry that had been etched into her features had been replaced by a quiet, steady confidence. She was no longer a victim of her circumstances, a woman defined by her losses. She was a leader, a respected administrator, her days filled with purpose. She had found her calling not in the wealth itself, but in the joy of using it to nurture a community back to health. Justice had found its way to the men who had tried to steal that future. Mark, his arrogance and ruthlessness exposed in a court of law, was sentenced to a lengthy prison term for assault, breaking and entering, and conspiracy. Arthur Pembroke Hale, rescued from the quarry with a shattered leg and a shattered reputation, was disgraced. The historical societies he had belonged to expelled him, and he faced his own legal consequences for the assault and the cruel, calculated threats against Sarah and her son. He had lost everything in his grasping pursuit of a treasure he never understood. The story ended as it had begun, on the steps of the chapel. Sarah stood with Leo and Buddy at her side, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink. The fog was beginning to roll into the hollow, but it was different now. It was not a shroud, but a gentle, silvery mist that softened the edges of the world, making it seem peaceful, magical. Leo, no longer a quiet, pensive observer, was laughing, a bright, carefree sound as he chased a firefly that blinked in the twilight. He was a happy, healthy boy, his world secure. Sarah looked out over the rooftops of Havenwood Hollow, a sense of deep, profound peace settling over her like a warm blanket. The $10 she had spent on a broken-down, forgotten chapel had not just bought her a building. It had bought her a future she could never have imagined, a purpose that filled her soul, and a place that was, finally and truly, home.